Assalamualaikum, Negeri Salam Sejahtera, and in Lumbawang Ro Ako, greetings to all. My name is Iskandar. I will try to present about friction between cultures in a Malaysian context. So, what do you understand about the Malaysian context in the cultural friction? Malaysia about the cultural. So, so before we start about in Malaysian context, we have to understand what is cultural friction. Imagine this arm you put into two arms. If a multicultural and unity is togetherness, but when is both the two cultures comprises against each other and a good cause, and this is friction. It's actually because of lack of harmony. It's a lack of harmony. Chemistry can occur between two cultures. So this complex nature consists of, in Malaysia, we call the cultural norms. The norms of between the two cultures. What did they like? They can't eat pork. Muslim Malay can't eat pork, so the Chinese can eat pork. That's one of the example of food. So when you serve food, you aren't supposed to prepare them pork in front of them. They won't eat it. So that's how to understand, and in the kitchen itself. And the expectation is people in Malaysia between cultures is as well. And um, all the cultures is diverse in different ways, so it has the contradicting approaches between the two people, especially when doing a problem solving in their methods. Decision making is also one of it. If you try to make a decision of making a holiday, especially in a Malaysian context, when you suddenly tell, okay, celebrating Raya, you got 1 week, but if you're celebrating Chinese New Year, you only have 2 days. People will say it's not fair. This is one of the things. The most common problem in the friction is is the language barrier itself. Language barrier is the most common. It's the most universal issue of it. Without the language you understand to each other, or different slang, or different wording, different meaning can create friction. When, for example, you're going for a meeting to discuss or propose, each word has a different meaning. That's what is cultural friction. So I'll give you an example of what's in Malaysian context what I'm trying to explain about. Please review on the picture on the top left, and you see these four young ladies who wear some very flashy dress. They're actually Malays. Malay people are actually very conservative. They're wearing a common dress that you see on the bottom left or bottom right. Sorry about that. On the bottom right is where the traditional dress of the Malays. This create rifts between cultures because Malay practice Islam, and such fashion is to be unacceptable. It's too modern, it's not part of it. And especially when you see on the top right, which is one of the famous part, an event called the Bond Dance, the Japanese Bond Dance. It runs in Malaysia. It was the first time in history doing this kind of cultural experience. Although the issue arises is when the date and the event started of the events, and you try to imagine that you're trying to make it work, and it started on the Maghrib prayers. This created an issue, especially on the conservative side. Try to understand when you see the observe the people they're dancing. It's fun. It's cultural experience, but the context itself reached to another group, which called the conservative group, the religious group. They will try to say this is not the way of Islam. We aren't supposed to sing and dance. That's what they felt about it. And you see on the top left, on the bottom left, sorry, is actually how does Malay perceive themselves. Try to see all this picture, you're not going to be sure what's going on around here. I'll give you the demographics in the next slide. Look over here. You check on your left side of the demographics. 50% of the population, based on the publications by Lewis Dalton, is actually 50% of the Malay. Majority of the population. Problem with this kind of publication is really a bit confusing is due because Malay has been divided by few parts of groups, and Bumiputra is also mixed inside of it. I understand that most of the researchers are trying to elaborate all the Malays and culture to people itself, but Malay is also a confusing culture itself, divided by few kinds of ethnics, which they comprise. And then you check on the right side. Malaysia is majority Islam, and that is an issue actually. When this is the dominance, when the government declared in the constitution as Malaysia is Islam, is an Islamic country, therefore the other religious group had to comply with the laws in Malaysia. That created another issue. So what does cause friction actually? It's like I said, remember where to put the two of my arms here. If you don't have the right method of business people, it will push each other. But when you try to hold like this is where people start to understand each other. So you can say a very simple one: misunderstood. Like I said, with language barrier, you could create misunderstanding between each culture itself. That's language is very important. The next important thing is actually the lack of cultural knowledge. In Malaysia itself, the cultural education itself is just basic, just barely a basic. People just know, oh, this is their culture, this is their ethnic Malay, or this is Indian, or this is the Sabahan culture, which Sabahan consists of more than 100 ethnic, 250 dialects, roughly, with an estimated amount of numbers of people. That is just part of Sabah. What about Sarawak? What about the northern side, like Kelantan, Terengganu? This is what the context has been. It's not just the Malay of the top. Even the Chinese community doesn't even know any kind of ethnics around Malaysia. So lack of cultural knowledge is important to be part of it. This is to prevent, again, what happened in the 1966 Malaysian riots, May 13th, was basically the cultural friction between three ethnics. And that does not align with their beliefs. So that is what about this cause of the friction. Is in a simple form. And I'll give you this picture. Try to depict right now the current situation in Malaysia is actually when the people talk about LGBT. LGBT is really relatively been a while a topic, but it's never been publicly or officially. So we see here the part of mixing feminism and LGBT become such an issue in Malaysia. Well, if you look at the picture there, LGBT in Malaysia is not that very well taught. It creates friction, not just this group. It creates friction among all because they believe there's no such thing as homosexuality, there's no same gender. They do believe in equality, but they have sense of the importance of culture because in Malaysian context culture, men has more power than women. That's how to watch it. So so the summary what I'm trying to say about cultural friction is actually cultural friction is actually complex. It's very phenomenal. It's the phenomenon itself that resulted because of diverse culture. Understand that diverse culture leads to this friction. It has creates borders between each other, but doesn't mean that it will create another bad things because this has the potential. It actually can foster. There's a reason why they create limits between each culture, is to create harmony. Remember, I told you, if you have too friction, you can't move. But how to use this? By understanding for cultural friction is to create borders of understanding, borders of limits. There's something to respect with each other, and that could create a community that is exclusive and can adapt to such a situation. I thank you.